He was a man of God.
Everything comes out of his conversation with the Lord. Everything.
And a man of the people.
If there were a Ronald Reagan of Catholicism, this was the person. He was a great communicator.
A man who would change history.
This is the most consequential pope of the last 500 years.
A cunning adversary to communist authorities.
A revolution.
A diehard champion of the poor.
This was a pope that was very sensitive to the suffering of people.
A pilgrim pope who never tired of tending his flock.
He just gritted his teeth and kept going.
For nearly 3 decades, in the shoes of the fisherman, his charm would disarm and endear, inspiring awe and adulation.
Perhaps I love you more.
Tonight, the life and death of Pope John Paul II.
Good evening. He was a leader for the ages and to people of all ages, especially the young. He is now, as one of the faithful said, in God's hands. Pope John Paul II died today at age 84. In Rome, tens of thousands of people converged on St. Peter's Square to share their grief, their memories, and a moment in history. Millions more gathered throughout the day in cities around the world to pay their final respects to the leader of the Roman Catholic Church. John Paul's health had been rapidly declining, and these past few days he had hovered near death. He died where he chose, in his private apartment at the Vatican. Hoda Kotb takes a look at the final day in the life of John Paul II.
Santo Padre Giovanni Paolo II è tornato alla casa del Padre.
John Paul II
Preghiamo per lui.
is going home. Let us pray for him.
Salve Regina, Mater Misericordiae.
When the announcement came just before 10 p.m. in Rome, it marked the end of an era. John Paul II had presided as Pope for more than a quarter century, leaving his mark not only on the Church, but on the world. The immediate reaction in Rome, grief and prayers.
Per I presenti di lingua italiana ripetiamo questo bel salmo dalla traduzione.
And here in the United States, praise for the man who united the world's 1 billion Catholics as few have ever done.
Peace be with you.
I know he's okay with God. And we're going to miss him. He's a great pope.
He treated everybody, not just Catholics, but everybody with a special kindness.
In Washington, the flag over the White House was lowered to half-staff. President Bush added his voice to the tributes.
We will always remember the humble, wise, and fearless priest who became one of history's great moral leaders. We're grateful to God for sending such a man.
Pope John Paul's health had been in decline for weeks since a serious bout with the flu in February sent him to the hospital with breathing troubles.
John Paul II has undergone a successful operation.
5 weeks ago, he had a breathing tube inserted in his throat and was said to be weakening. The Pope rallied enough to appear at last week's Easter celebrations, but then, in a painful moment of public suffering, his voice failed him as he tried to bless the faithful.
Late today, the health of Pope John Paul II took a rather dramatic turn for the worse.
Thursday night, with reports that the Pope's blood pressure and temperature were unstable due to an infection, it was apparent the pontiff's decline was accelerating. Friday morning, it was clear that the end was near, a fact driven home by the Vatican spokesman as he choked back tears while briefing the world on the pontiff's condition. Outside the Pope's residence, tens of thousands of admirers prayed. Thousands and thousands more gathered in the Pope's native Poland and around the world.
We just come here to pray that, he'll get better, and if he doesn't, that he'll pass away peacefully.
Throughout the night, the faithful kept a vigil as the Pope reportedly hovered on the edge of life, his vital organs slowly failing. Saturday dawned clear and quiet over St. Peter's Square. As the crowd slowly reassembled there and around the world, it was reported that the Pope was slipping in and out of consciousness, as he gave his final farewells when he could. And then, with the pealing of the bells at St. Peter's Cathedral, it was over.
Agnus Dei qui tollis peccata mundi.
As the crowd of 70,000 gathered in St. Peter's Square recited the Rosary, countless others celebrated Mass around the world. Church and national leaders added their voices to the outpouring of faith and affection. Pope John Paul II, born Karol Wojtyła, one of the most influential men of the 20th century, was dead.
And joining us now from the Vatican, NBC's Matt Lauer. Matt, what's the mood there right now?
I think there's still an element of stunned silence in the square behind me, Stone. I mean, this is the event that everyone seemed to expect and no one seemed to be prepared for. When the word spread here just after 9:37 local time that in fact Pope John Paul II had died, the crowd immediately fell silent, and then there were pockets of applause, which is a traditional Italian tribute to a great person upon that person's passing. There were prayers said in the square behind me. Some 70,000 people gathered. They were told at one point by the Undersecretary of State Archbishop Leonardo Sandri that we all feel like orphans this evening, and I think that could probably be seen on the faces of many of the people who were pressed into St. Peter's Square. At one point, I heard some singing from a corner here, and then as the prayers ended, I watched people streaming out of St. Peter's Square, and I should mention at the same time, as we came here this evening, there were people streaming into this area, all, I think, wanting to be a part of this moment in history in some small way, Stone.
You know, Matt, I would imagine that while most of them there are Italians, you must hear a lot of different languages, a lot of different pilgrims from all over the world.
Well, and not only that, but obviously Rome is a tourist haven, and so there are people here who were had scheduled these trips long in advance, but as the word got out that the Pope was gravely ill, I think a lot of people began to come to Vatican City simply to try to be here at the appropriate time and offer their prayers and support. Yes, a lot of Americans here, obviously a lot of Polish citizens here as well. And now they're all trying to come to grips with the loss of this great Pope and also with the events that will transpire when, for between 4 and 6 days, the Pope's body lies in state here in St. Peter's Square, a funeral, a state funeral, we should mention, which is going to be, as you can imagine, an enormous logistical effort. The security preparations alone to get all these world leaders in here and secure this area is going to be quite an effort. That will take place between the 4th and 6th day, then 9 days of mourning, and then no less than 15 days, no more than 20 days after today, the conclave will begin that will result in the election of a new Pope.
A lot ahead. Matt, thank you.
All right, Stone.
We'll see Matt again tomorrow on Today. And when we return, the long journey from a small Polish town to the Vatican, looking back at the life and life's work of Pope John Paul II as our special coverage continues. John Paul II was called the People's Pope, but that title only partly explains the true nature of his authority and his legacy. He was a man of action, charismatic, courageous, and deeply devout. Yet when he became Pope nearly 3 decades ago, few could have predicted how influential this pontiff would become. Here's John Hockenberry.
This was the moment John Paul II was introduced to the world. At 58, he was the youngest pope in more than a century, the first non-Italian since the 1500s, the first Polish pope ever. He was little known, but the cardinal from Krakow, Poland would prove a momentous choice. His life's work would confront the communist world and change the course of history.
This is the most consequential pope of the last 500 years. A great world statesman, a man who had an enormous impact on the history of the 20th century.
During his reign, he brought the papacy to the world. From deep in Africa to the American heartland, To the adoring crowds of his native Poland, John Paul reached out to his flock of nearly 1 billion Catholics. In all, he kissed the ground of more than 100 countries, was a fixture on television, became a best-selling author, as much at home on the internet as he was in St. Peter's Square.
He responded to the technological changes of our era. He responded to the historical moments, the fact that he was the Polish Pope. All of these things moved together to make him the right man at the right time.
He was fluent in 8 languages, could speak many more. When he was warmly welcomed in the far corners of the earth, he often repaid the kindness by speaking to people in their native tongues.
God bless America.
Niech będzie pochwalony Jezus Chrystus.
Or at times misspeaking.
He had a remarkable capacity for putting you at your ease.
Biographer George Weigel had rare access to the Pope, spending more than 25 hours in personal meetings with him.
He was not interested at all, and indeed was slightly embarrassed by the kind of courtesies that were traditionally extended to popes, such as the kissing of his ring.
But that papal ring was a symbol of a moral authority that he used as a force for human rights the world over.
It is we who must choose between evil and good.
Battling his conception of evil with the power of the church was the ever-present theme of his papacy. Just months after his elevation to Pope, John Paul confronted communism with an historic visit to his native land. It was a visit that changed the world, but it was also a homecoming for a man whose spirit and passion were born in the ancient village culture of Poland, its rhythms and traditions stretching back through the centuries.
He once said to me that I can only be understood from inside. The first thing you have to understand about this Pope is that he's a mystic, and everything comes out of his conversation with the Lord. Everything.
He was born Karol Wojtyła in the small Polish town of Wadowice in 1920. Both athlete and brilliant student, he lost his mother when he was 8, his only brother 4 years later, and learned from his father a love of country and a deep sense of piety.
Young Karol Wojtyła learned from his father that to be manly and to be prayerful were not contradictory.
He was a soccer player in high school, where teams were segregated by religion. But whenever the Jewish team needed a goaltender, he stepped in.
He was the first pope since Peter to grow up among Jews.
Author Carl Bernstein says Karol Wojtyła's teenage passion was acting and playwriting. One of his closest friends from that time was a Jewish girl named Ginka Beer.
Her father had decided in 1938 that it wasn't safe for Jews any longer and came to the Wojtyła's house to tell Karol and his father that she was leaving. He was just totally broken up.
He was just 19 when the Nazis invaded Poland to start World War II. During the brutal occupation, he labored in a limestone quarry. In 1941, his revered father died, and at the age of 20, his family was gone. Just to the west of his hometown was Auschwitz, the death camp that claimed 3 million lives. It was a tumultuous time that deeply moved young Karol Wojtyła and set him on a path to a new family, the priesthood.
This is a pope who, in his early life, experienced suffering, experienced pain.
Vatican scholar Thomas Rees says the only way to understand the Pope is to look at the struggles of the Polish people.
He lived as a Pole, as a persecuted nationality. As a result, this had a tremendous impact on him when he became Pope. This was a Pope that was very sensitive to the suffering of people and of the Church.
He was a young priest when the Soviet Union claimed Poland for its communist empire. It was a blow to everything he believed in, and one he would never forget. And when, as Pope, he made that pilgrimage to Poland in 1979, he was settling an old score, not just as the spiritual leader of the Catholic Church, but as a former worker fighting side by side with his countrymen, the Union Movement Solidarity's most crucial supporter. The visit gripped the nation. An estimated 1 in 3 Poles came out to see the Pope in person. From Moscow to Washington, the world took notice.
When there was an opportunity for freedom in Eastern Europe, he knew exactly what to do at the right time, at the right moment.
10 years before the Berlin Wall would fall, John Paul had bolstered his homeland and inflicted the first sizable dent in the Iron Curtain. Karl Marx, the father of communism, had called religion the opium of the masses. It was suddenly clear that religion would pose the gravest threat to communism in the person of John Paul. Then, in May of 1981, there was an attempt on the Pope's life. He suffered gunshot wounds to his stomach, but recovered quickly. But who would want to assassinate the Holy Father? In the political climate of the early 1980s, the Italian government called it an act of war. The Pope had challenged communist authority in Eastern Europe, but accusations of a communist conspiracy linking the would-be assassin Mehmet Ali Agca to the Bulgarian secret police and the Soviet KGB were never proved, and the shooting remains a mystery. For his part, the Pope sought out Agca for a personal meeting. His motivation? To offer forgiveness and share a moment of silent prayer with the man who had tried to kill him. Throughout the 80s, the Pope continued to aid the forces that would eventually topple the Soviet Empire and bring an end to the Cold War.
He was the indispensable figure in the collapse of European communism. He was the inspiration of a revolution of conscience that made the nonviolent political revolution possible.
And this Pope did not just take on communism. His meetings through the years with a string of American presidents were always cordial, but his warnings to the West were frequent and no less stern.
We cannot stand idly by when thousands of human beings are dying of hunger.
John Paul saw excess and materialism in the affluent West and called it moral decline. And despite the changing values of many Catholics, on social questions he held to traditional church views, saying no to divorce, contraception, women in the priesthood, and abortion.
The Catholic Church is unambiguously committed to protecting and cherishing every human life, including the life of the unborn.
Critics said he was out of step with the modern world, but when John Paul reached out to the young, they turned out by the millions.
We love you! Perhaps I love you more.
He had kind of an avuncular style. He could be a stern uncle and saying, now this is the way you should behave.
He told them a modern world that allowed abortions, the death penalty, or mercy killings was building a culture of death, and his insistent vision remained absolute.
Listen to what Christ the Redeemer is saying to you.
His views on sex were absolute as well. But this Pope was not a prude. When the Sistine Chapel was restored, he ordered drapings removed from Michelangelo's masterpiece, restoring figures to their original nudity. In the context of a husband, a wife, and a family, the Pope could celebrate human sexuality. John Paul had no doubt about the moral force of his mission, a serenity that came through constant prayer, up to 7 hours a day.
Prayer was the rhythm of his life. This ongoing conversation with his Lord was the conversation that formed the drumbeat.
For more than 2 decades, John Paul remained remarkably active. His pilgrimage to the Holy Land was something he had longed for from his first days as Pope. And after his challenges to communism and capitalism, he spoke about the failings of the Church itself. With the simple words, we humbly ask for forgiveness. John Paul delivered an historic apology that he said would purify the memory of the Church's errors over the past 2,000 years. In the last years of his life, his health failed, and he suffered from what was widely believed to be Parkinson's disease.
This is a man who, during his life, experienced a lot of physical pain, and yet he was like a professional athlete. He just gritted his teeth and kept going because he wanted to continue to serve the people of God.
His body may have faltered, but his convictions never did. In a cynical world at the start of a new millennium, his was a rare voice indeed, and one that Catholics believe spoke directly to God.
The deepest core of his inside was his conviction that in Jesus Christ, the world had been given the answer to the deepest yearnings of the human heart. That's who he was, and that is the legacy that he has left.
When we come back, Pope John Paul's personal touch. Some of those who met him share the intimate moments of kindness, courage, and humor they will never forget, as our special coverage continues. He was the religious leader of more than 1 billion people, and he seemed intent on reaching out to every one of them, everywhere. Throughout Pope John Paul's long life, he also had a remarkable talent for friendship, for making and holding on to personal connections. And as you're about to see, he never forgot a face. Here's Victoria Corderi.
He traveled the globe for a quarter of a century and prayed with millions. Yet those who knew him say it was Pope John Paul II's power to touch individual lives that set him apart.
Whether they were part of a crowd of 1 million or just maybe 5 or 6 people, there was always that sense that you were included. He was embracing you, no matter whether the crowd was big or small.
Monsignor John Strzenkowski, who met the Pope a dozen times over the years, remembers a man who readily took to the job.
The very day after his election, he left the Vatican, and there came the Pope's car. And he stood erect and in the car and smiling and waving to people. And it was obvious he knew he was Pope. You know, he was in charge, and he seemed to have fit right into his role as chief shepherd of the church.
A year later, during the Pope's visit to the United States, Monsignor Strzenkowski experienced for himself the Pope's uncanny ability to make people feel special.
When he came to Yankee Stadium, his first visit, then in 1979, he went around the whole stadium on the field. But it was a strange thing. Our eyes met, and he nodded toward me, and so I nodded back. And a priest who was up toward the front came running back and said, "The Pope recognized somebody here. The Pope recognized somebody here." I said, well, in all humility, I think I have to say it was me. So he had that touch, that ability to reach out to people.
Gloria Pavel still remembers taking her blind 16-year-old daughter to meet the Pope during his visit to Washington, D.C. in 1979. He stopped to bless the disabled.
When he heard me ask Gloria if she could see him, he bent down so that she could see him and see his face. And that's when he kissed her on the cheek and gave her a blessing. And then Gloria said, "Ja ci kocham" to him in Polish, and it means, "I love you." Then the Pope said, "I love you too, Gloria." And it just made it so personal. It's such a wonderful feeling.
Though Gloria's mother had forgotten a camera that day, when she opened the newspaper the following morning, she saw that the moment had been captured by a photographer, a reminder of a tender and treasured encounter. One of many in this time of remembrance. Polish-born author Lena Allen Shore struck up a correspondence with the Pope that lasted for 25 years. His letters now give her comfort.
This was a special friend. This was a friend who in a certain way fulfilled my longings, my dreams. Why? Because he was like he was. I feel very privileged that this man took part in my life.
They finally met 18 years after they first started exchanging letters. Lena brought along her son, Jack.
He took my son head in his two hands, and he kissed him on the forehead, because he knew also that Jacques lost his father at the age of 11, and he lost his mother at the age of 9. And I knew he wanted to give courage to my son,
Lena shared a love of philosophy and poetry with the Pope, who was a great admirer of the arts, a facet of his personality that endeared him to many musicians. On a visit to Chicago in 1979, the Pope attended a concert in his honor given by the Chicago Symphony Orchestra.
He looked younger than his age. He had the beautiful, beautiful skin and erect, tall man.
Victor Ate was the orchestra's concertmaster. He says he didn't pay nearly enough attention to his conductor that night.
One eye was at the conductor and one eye was at the Pope, and we tried to get his reaction, and he was attentive and enjoyed it very much.
Afterwards, the Pope let Ate and the orchestra know just how much he had enjoyed himself.
He had a way of communicating with his eyes and put you in ease.
Ate says the Pope's humility and humor entertained the cheering crowd after the concert, when the Pope reminded the audience that he was not the star of the show.
I assure you, I am not the Chicago Orchestra. I am only the Pope. God bless you. God bless you.
A memory of a special night that echoes even more sweetly now.
To have the symphony and this beautiful church and the Pope together. And how many times in a lifetime can you duplicate this? Never. It happens only once.
A lofty figure with a common touch. A man of God who inspired people to move mountains.
Over 20 years, I was able to get about 10 people to stand with me in a fight against communism from a nation of 40 million people. And then the Pole was elected Pope. It was the most incredible thing.
Lech Walesa, the former shipyard worker turned union leader, says the Pope encouraged him to persevere in forming the Solidarity movement that helped break communism's stranglehold on Poland. When he visited the country in 1979, the Pope's words mobilized the nation.
Then the Pope said those magic words, "Don't be afraid. Change the course of the country." A year after he left, from those 10 people I had, I was able to add 10 million more to our organization. I was absolutely convinced that this was a gift from heaven.
He told us today their many meetings over the years were more than just political.
I am a person of faith, so I was meeting with the representative of Christ.
But it was the Pope's striking humanity that some people remember, and his sense of humor.
It's that spontaneity and playfulness. There's a playful spirit about him that I think wins people over.
A lightheartedness that helped him cope with debilitating illness.
When he was still walking and he had the cane, and he would fool around with the cane, you know, he would shake it at people and things. But I think that kind of brings together his determination, his courage, but at the same time, his sense of humor. You know, yeah, you know, I'm hurting, but, you know, we can also laugh about this too.
In the end, Pope John Paul II's place in history is still to be determined, but not the impact he had on millions of people as he touched them one at a time.
I just felt like he was an extraordinary man. He was perfect for the job. I think that Pope John Paul II has really touched the world.
When we come back, former Secretary of State Colin Powell joins us with more on Pope John Paul's legacy as our special coverage continues. And joining us now from Washington is former Secretary of State Colin Powell. Mr. Secretary, thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Stone.
You met with this Pope on numerous occasions. Your personal reflections tonight?
You know, we all were expecting this to happen. Nevertheless, when I got the word not too long ago, a deep sadness came over me, and I was shocked. I couldn't believe it had actually happened. I met the Pope on 3 different occasions over the past 20 years. I had a private audience with him the year before last. He was a remarkable man. It was an electric experience being in his presence, this man of God, this man of the people of all faiths. He will be greatly missed. We used to have some interesting conversations during those audiences, and he was always interested in what I was doing with respect to helping people in Africa, dealing with issues of poverty and disease. And so this was a great man. He was a moral force that helped change the world for the better.
How would you characterize the role he played on the world stage, most notably in the role on the fall of communism?
He gave inspiration to the people of the world, especially the people that were behind the Iron Curtain in the early years of his service as the Pope. And he knew what they needed because he was one of them. So when he went behind the Iron Curtain, when he spoke from this side of the Iron Curtain, he was quietly giving them encouragement. He was letting them know that they were God's children, that they would soon be free. They would soon have the same opportunity as all other God's children had. But his message went beyond just the people behind the Iron Curtain. It went to people all over the world who feel oppressed or who are in sickness and who are suffering from poverty and disease. He is such a moral force, and he never stopped. He traveled long after many would have said to him, it's time to slow down and stop. He knew that he was God's messenger and that his work had to continue until the very end.
He was a spiritual leader, not a politician. But how direct could he be when he felt strongly about a policy he disagreed with?
When he felt strongly, he spoke out. And on those areas that he has responsibility for speaking as the head of the Catholic Church, I think he spoke rather clearly and directly. But through his spiritual leadership, he conveyed as well a political message that talked about freedom and openness and democracy. So yes, he was a spiritual leader, but many spiritual leaders also convey a moral message that in turn is a political message.
He reached out to both sides in the Middle East. How powerful was he there as a force for peace?
I think he was a powerful force for peace. Both sides respected him. His religion was not of either side, but he was seen as somebody who was concerned about both sides, that was interested in, somebody who was interested in reconciliation and peace and getting through the problems of the present to a brighter future for all people. So even in that part of the world, he was an important person, an important political figure, if I may say so, but above all, in that Holy Land, he was an important spiritual figure that was a living witness to what all of our faiths believe should be the case in the Middle East. People living side by side in peace, respecting each other's religions, respecting each other's right to have a decent life and to raise our children in peace and safety.
In your estimation, what will this Pope's greatest legacy be?
The fact that during a time of challenge, as the Cold War raged and then came to an end, he exerted his moral authority. In a time when people are searching for meaning, he was a source of meaning. He had a long tenure as Pope, and it will be a life of service as well as a tenure in his years as Pope that will be long remembered for compassion, for a message of reconciliation, a message of peace, a message of hope. He will be missed, obviously, by Catholics around the world, but more than that, he'll be missed by all of us around the world who shared those same goals and objectives, that same spirit that he did to seek peace and reconciliation among fellow human beings.
Secretary Powell, thanks for joining us. When we come back, an American maestro's unique bond with the Polish Pope as our special coverage continues. The Reverend Billy Graham today called Pope John Paul II, and I quote, unquestionably the most influential voice for morality and peace in the last 100 years. That voice spoke eloquently to people of all religious faiths, especially to one man with whom the Pope shared a unique and powerful tie. Here's Victoria Corderi.
When conductor Gilbert Levine first met Pope John Paul II 17 years ago, he had no idea the profound effect it would have on his life. A Jew from Brooklyn, who had barely ever spoken to a priest, summoned to the Vatican by the Polish-born leader of more than 1 billion Catholics. He was about to enter a world few are allowed to see.
This is the Vatican. What am I doing here? I was very nervous. You walk through 14 rooms or something, I don't even know, to get to the private library. And I was expecting to be a lot of people there, and he was all alone. And he rose, guided me to his desk, put his hand on my hand, and said, "We must talk."
The Pope had read about Levine in 1987, after he had become the conductor of Poland's Krakow Symphony. During the meeting, the Pope spoke to him of his beloved hometown and the city in which he had risen to prominence, and about the Holocaust. Then the meeting ended oddly.
And he's about to leave, and he turns around, he's got this impish grin on his face, he says, "See you at your concert." I said, what concert? What are you talking about?
6 months later, the Pope invited Levine back to the Vatican to conduct a concert celebrating the 10th anniversary of his papacy. From that point on, Levine became the Pope's Maestro, planning and conducting countless papal concerts all over the world.
What do you think it was that intrigued the Pope about you, that started this relationship?
He knew that I was a relative of survivors, and that the Holocaust was powerfully in my soul. He'd grown up with Jews. Jews were his friends. They were in and out of his house. They were people that he felt comfortable and easy with. They were murdered. Most of them were murdered. And I think that has been with him all of his life.
Though they mostly spoke to each other in Polish, Levine says, the language they really shared was music. And its ability to inspire spirituality.
You don't sit there and analyze the music. You are engulfed by it. You are,
it engages you.
Engages you spiritually. And I think he understood that.
And there's a universal quality.
Absolutely. And you don't have to be Catholic, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu to love music and to understand its message.
In 1994, 6 years after they met, Levine proposed what he considered a bold idea, that the pontiff attend a concert he was planning to commemorate the Holocaust. He said the Pope not only embraced the concept, but he made a startling, unprecedented offer.
I went to him and said, "Will you come?" And he said, "No, I have one better. I would like to do it in the Vatican. But Maestro, tell me, will my gesture of reconciliation and memory be accepted?"
The news sent ripples through religious circles. Holocaust victims gathered in the holiest of Catholic enclaves, under the eyes of the Pope, the chief rabbi, and the President of Italy. The concert was telecast in 22 countries. The event was especially poignant for Levine's mother-in-law, a concentration camp survivor who had lost 40 family members to the Holocaust.
She was at the concert to commemorate the Holocaust. She lit a candle. 6 candles were lit for the Holocaust. They had a relationship that was only possible between people who had seen this evil up front, from different sides of the wall. And she underwent a transformation, and they healed. You're talking about healing each other. They really healed each other.
Perhaps the most unlikely result of all the hours Levine has spent in the company of this devout Catholic leader is that the Maestro has become a more faithful Jew. He went from not attending synagogue at all to converting to Orthodox Judaism.
It sounds, the way you described your relationship, like he's sort of a spiritual mentor.
The eliciting of a more powerful Jewish identity and Jewish faith is something that I think he actually encouraged, very strangely. He could have tolerated my Judaism.
Or tried to convert you.
Which,
none of the above.
Which, by the way, is not, to me, inconceivable. Why didn't he do it? because I had a faith. He elicited that faith. He deepened that faith. He respected that faith.
He just cared that people had faith.
Yes, powerfully, powerfully. He was a great Catholic, but he also was a person who honored other people's faith. Buddhists, Hindus, Muslims, Jews. Just did. It was who he was.
So it seems fitting that the last major papal concert in 2004 was one of reconciliation, where Jews, Muslims, and Christians all gathered under one roof, for that day, fulfilling a Pope's dream. 3 months ago, Levine says he visited the Pope for what would be his final goodbye. But he says what he's learned from the pontiff will be with him always.
I think I conduct better. I think I've learned more about my art through my working for him. And I will carry that on in my professional career. Whatever else I do in my lifetime, nothing will compare.
The Pope visited this country almost as much as he visited his Polish homeland, 7 visits in all to the U.S., each one an opportunity to communicate directly with the nearly 1/4 of Americans who are Roman Catholics. Rudy Giuliani was mayor of New York when the Pope visited this city in 1995, and he joins us now to share some of his memories. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
First of all, your reaction to today's news.
Well, it's sadness at losing a great leader, and you don't have many great leaders. Certainly, you don't have many like Pope John Paul II, but great sense of fulfillment and joy that we had him for as long as we did. I think the thing he would want us to be tonight is joyful, even though there's a sense of sadness that, you know, we're missing a great leader.
Well, speaking of joy, that scene in Central Park in 1995. New York turned out for this Pope when he came to visit.
Oh, it was a beautiful experience.
Do you have a personal memory or anecdote from that trip?
I have a number of them. One was when he did the rosary at St. Patrick's Cathedral, and we, of course, had worked very, very hard on the security. Pope had almost been killed, and there were serious threats against the Pope's life, which is hard to believe. Police and the Secret Service had outlined a very, very rigid route for him. And when he was supposed to leave the cathedral and go right into the Pope-mobile, he just walked right away from the police, because the police would find it hard going up to the Pope, and he walked right into the crowd. And the police didn't know what to do. What do you do? Yell at him, "Hey, Pope, come on back."
He wanted to connect with the people.
It was the most electrifying thing. And then I remember when he first arrived at the heliport, my son Andrew gave him a Yankee cap. And he took it, and he patted him on the head, and then he spent all his time with the children. You know, you could see, I mean, you could just feel the love that he had for these children.
You led this city through its greatest moment of crisis. How much inspiration did you draw from this Pope and his leadership?
I drew a tremendous amount of inspiration from the Pope. You know, all throughout my life, I think of him as one of the 2 people, at least that I got to know, that helped to save Eastern Europe and bring down the Berlin Wall and the Iron Curtain. He and Ronald Reagan. And I keep thinking both of them were almost killed early, in one case the presidency, the other case the papacy. And I often thought what would have happened if either or both of them had turned out the other way. I thought of the Pope very often before September 11th, thought of him a lot afterwards, because he was a man of principle. You know, no matter whether you agreed or disagreed with his particular conclusion, you knew it came from his best analysis of his principles and his role, and it came out of a very honest heart. And now we can pray to him and ask for his help.
Rudy Giuliani, thanks for joining us tonight. Good to see you. When we come back, an insider's view, some final thoughts from an observer who watched Pope John Paul II up close for a quarter century, as our special coverage, The Life and Death of Pope John Paul II, continues. In the last quarter of the 20th century, Pope John Paul II firmly believed his ministry could help right the wrongs of one of the most turbulent times in human history. Keith Miller covered the Pope for more than 2 decades for NBC News. Tonight he recalls John Paul, the bridge builder.
Caring, tolerant, and with an enormous capacity to connect to people, John Paul II became many things to so many people. In traveling the world with the Pope for 25 years, I discovered a man totally without fear. The first world leader to use his moral authority to tell it like it is. John Paul wasn't influenced by politics or power. He confronted leaders across the political spectrum. In the Philippines, the Pope berated the then dictator Ferdinand Marcos for allowing the poor to starve. To Cuba's communist leader Fidel Castro, the Pope demanded greater political and religious freedom. To the leader of the West, President George W. Bush, John Paul delivered a lecture on human rights, saying the abuse at the Abu Ghraib prison was shameful. His blunt, direct attitude toward injustice was formed by the two political systems he came to despise. An early childhood of fear and repression growing up under Nazi occupation. And later, underground opposition to the communist regime that ruled his native Poland with an iron fist. John Paul was also shaped by the loss of his mother, brother, and father at a young age. And certainly his deep mystical connection to God gave him courage. When he was shot by an assassin in 1981, the Pope said it hurt, and he was stunned, but he said he wasn't afraid. He was fearless, yet it didn't affect his humility. He had the most powerful voice on earth, yet was devoted to tolerance, and wasn't afraid to admit mistakes.
The word pontiff means bridge builder, and John Paul did what no pope had ever done before. He apologized for what he called the church's long history of intolerance and persecution.
I was with him when he slipped a note of forgiveness between the rocks of the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem. And at the memorial to the 6 million Jewish victims of the Holocaust, John Paul apologized for the way Jews had been treated in the past by his church. The symbolism was both moving and heroic. I heard so often from American Catholics how authoritarian John Paul was. Some said he was out of touch with the modern world. I wondered. So on a visit to America, I asked him how he felt knowing that many of the faithful didn't abide by the church's teachings on birth control, divorce, and opposed him on the issue of women in the priesthood. Smiling, touching my arm, he said, "I'm like a father. My children won't always obey me, but that doesn't stop me from loving them." And they loved him back. Because John Paul had the capacity to connect with people of all faiths from every land. His early interest in acting in the theater made him a natural to use the world as his stage. He thrived on drama. This is the scene in his native Poland when he gave voice to the solidarity movement opposed to communist rule. The world was watching, and the Pope knew it and used it to deliver a message of freedom that helped topple the Soviet Empire. I was with him on his last trip to Poland in 2002, where he said a final goodbye. There were tears, not all sad. Some people were overcome with emotion, remembering the Pope from Poland, fearless in his defense of human rights. And in some small way, he gave me and hundreds of millions of people a measure of courage.
Shortly after the official period of mourning for John Paul ends, the secret deliberations to choose the next pope begin. And when the white smoke curls from the Vatican chimney, it will signal a new era for the world's Catholics, a new leader for the 21st century. Coming up tonight on MSNBC, Chris Matthews live from the Vatican, reporting on the possible candidates to replace the Pope. That and the latest reaction to the Pope's death here on NBC and your local NBC station. And join Matt and Katie tomorrow, beginning at 8 Eastern, for a special Sunday Today. I'm Stone Phillipson for all of us at NBC News.